Hi, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion hosted by CRASSH on the film Arica to coincide with the film's UK festival premiere at the Cambridge Film Festival. Just a brief introduction to the film. Arica follows the story of a groundbreaking case against Boliden, a Swedish mining company that exported 20,000 tons of toxic waste in the mid-1980s to the Chilean town of Arica, where thousands of people have since become ill or have died from cancer. The film was made by Lars Edman and William Johansson, and it was produced by Radio Film. Just to say, we would very much recommend that you view the film before watching this panel discussion, as it's very likely to contain spoilers. The film is about a personal journey made by Lars back to the country of his birth, and it tells some very difficult personal stories of some of the people that Lars and William met in Arica and that they've been in contact with since making the first film that exposed the scandal in the first place, called Toxic Playground, which was released in 2010. And the film Arica raises some very interesting questions about who is ultimately responsible for this toxic waste scandal, about the complex legal processes involved in bringing a case like this to court, and about the role of documentary filmmaking. So moving beyond perhaps the exposing of such scandals to become itself an instigator of social change. And in this discussion, we're going to focus on all of these questions and more, I'm sure, with the help of our guests. And first, some brief introductions. I'm Joanna Page. I'm a professor of Latin American literature and visual culture at Cambridge. And some of my research has involved studying how environmental concerns are being addressed in contemporary cinema, art, and other forms of cultural production in Latin America. Also on the panel with us today, we have William Johansson, the co-director of Arica. William began to explore the Arica scandal as a film student, and he's now a partner at Leica Film, an independent production company in Stockholm with a host of credits, Oscar nominations, and international awards to his name. Dr. Ellie Smith is the impact producer for Arica. Since 2002, she's been working within the fields of international human rights, international criminal law, and humanitarian law. And as the impact producer for the film, she's worked alongside people from the affected communities in Chile as they continue to seek justice for the damage caused by Boliden's waste. We also have with us Dr. Paul Merchant, who's a senior lecturer in Latin American film and visual culture at the University of Bristol. He's worked extensively in Chile during his career. And alongside his expertise in film and a particular interest in the interface between cinema and other art forms, Paul is also the co-director of the Centre for Environmental Humanities at Bristol. And the final member of our panel is Rogelio Luque-Lora, who's currently completing his PhD at the University of Cambridge, exploring the relationship between the environmental and political spheres with a particular focus on Chile. And so before we look in more detail at the fascinating political, ethical, legal issues that the film addresses, I wanted to ask William, first of all, to tell us something about the experience of making the film. In part, as I've said, it tells the story of Lars's journey back to Chile, where he was born before being brought up in Sweden. William, you don't appear on camera, but I imagine that the film was also, of course, a journey for you. Can you talk a little bit about the experience of working on the project in Chile? What did you learn through the experience about Chile or about international law, or about documentary filmmaking? Any of those questions would work for starters.
Yeah, I mean, this film has really been a long journey. I'm also from the north of Sweden, the same area as Boliden and also as Lars. So it was also when we first heard about this, and we realized that this company where the gold has meant prosperity and a lot of good things for us and our society, that they had sent toxic waste to Chile and Arica, where Boliden only means a big toxic pile of arsenic and lead and mercury. So it was very obvious for both of us that this was something that we had to do. And I mean, it's I think first time when we went up to Arica, we were film students. We had these cameras that were like scotched together, and just taking this very, very long bus drive all the way up, living with Jocelyn and her family. And that was in 2004, the end of 2004. And since then, I mean, we have been on this. So it's really a big part of both my life and Lars' life. So it's, you can say that it's a lot more than just a film.
Thanks. And Ellie, just to bring you in here, could you tell us a little bit about your connection with the film and the broader campaign that it's incited?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned earlier, I've worked with victims of mass atrocity crimes for the last 20 or so years. So our approach to the film, because we were kind of inspired by the huge sense of injustice of the people of Arica, we looked at an impact campaign through a justice lens. So we had the idea was that we would have elements on prevention, accountability, and reparation. And so, although the health and environmental consequences in Arica have been absolutely catastrophic, but it's just one example of a much wider corporate practice of moving hazardous waste materials from the developed to the developing world. And we were able to team up with the Basel Action Network, which is a very small and very active NGO based in Seattle, who've been campaigning for 25 years to have the movement of, excuse me, toxic waste from the developed to developing world made unlawful. And at the time that we joined forces with them, they needed 2 more states to sign up to an amendment to the Basel Convention. So the Basel Convention is an international treaty that regulates transboundary movement of hazardous materials. And William and I had a screening at the UN. It was at a kind of a pre-meeting for all the kind of parties to the Basel Convention back in 2018, I think, William. Yep, he's nodding. And at the time, the ban amendment, as it was called, had fallen off the agenda. And we managed to kind of inspire enough people at the time to kind of lobby for it to be included back onto the agenda of the main meeting. And sort of after that happened, there was quite a lot of advocacy by Switzerland and Indonesia working collaboratively to really push for states to sign up to the ban amendment, and that finally came into force in December 2019. So as of December 2019, the movement of hazardous waste from the developed to the developing world has become unlawful for those states that have signed up to that, and that's around 100 states. So it obviously it doesn't cover every polluter. It's like countries like Australia, New Zealand, India and the US haven't, for example, signed the Basel Convention. If they do now sign the Basel Convention, they are also bound by the amendment. So it's not absolutely perfect, but it's pretty monumental, and it was 25 years in the offing, and it's still hugely significant now in terms of, we see, plastic waste being shipped around the world now for apparent recycling, and electronic waste. And we see countries now like Malaysia and the Philippines returning waste to the countries they came from and saying, look, we're not going to accept your waste anymore. So so that's where we worked on the prevention element. In terms of, excuse me, looking at kind of more accountability, we wanted to focus attention on the activities of the Chilean government, the Swedish government, and Boliden itself. And we worked through, we made some contacts with a great organization called Franciscans International, who have standing before various UN committees and have real expertise in putting communications before UN bodies. And for Chile, we were very kind of mindful of the regular kind of universal periodic review of their treaty commitments, and we submitted communications to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and also the Committee on the Rights of Women, because a lot of women and girls are disproportionately affected by the waste. In Arica, there's a very, very high rate of abortion, miscarriage, neurological birth defects, real difficulties in conceiving, and also it disproportionately affects women because they tend to be carers for the sick as well. So, though we had those committees asking questions of the Chilean government, and we also had the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights asking questions to the Swedish government. I think it kind of felt like we really, really gained real international momentum when we submitted a communication to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Toxics, Marcos Orellana. And he has taken our complaint on board, and he and I think it's 8 in total UN Special Rapporteurs, so 7 other ones for things like migrants, extreme poverty, water and sanitation, housing, health, the right to health, right to a safe environment, have now issued letters to the governments of Chile, the government of Sweden, and Boliden themselves as a company, asking for various forms of remedial action for the people in Chile. And I think at the moment I'm hoping at the moment there's discussions going on between Sweden and Chile around the issue of repatriation of waste. So one of the things that we're really, really pushing for is that the waste is removed. I mean, there's a legal basis for the polluter in this, the generator of the waste, in this case, Boliden, reassuming responsibility for the waste. And they now have facilities in Sweden. Or is it Sweden or is it in Norway, William?
In Sweden, you mean the
in the the underground smelt.
Exactly, under the Rönnskär smelter, where the waste actually came from.
Yeah.
You can also see in the film where Lars and Rodrigo are pointing, and Lars is saying, "This is, they have this tunnel here, you call it. So 300 meters down there, they have this storage room."
Yeah. So they now have the facilities back in Sweden to safely house, well, as safely as you can, toxic waste. So the waste of the type seen that's currently left in an unsafe situation in Arica. So that's also part of the reparations for the community as well, because it's hugely symbolic, the fact that they're still living, basically around this 20,000 tons of waste that's it's exposed to the elements, and it threatens to pollute their drinking water, and it blows in the wind. It's incredibly hazardous, and it absolutely wouldn't be accepted in the West. I think that's what's really, really key. It's like things are happening there that we wouldn't tolerate, and certainly wouldn't be tolerated in Sweden or the UK. And also within Chile itself, there have been sort of screenings for sort of memorialization purposes, and sort of to enable people to get together. And there's also been an amazing mural that's been produced around so that the waste itself is all has a wall, is all walled off, and they've now painted an incredible mural that sort of tells the story of how the waste got there, and yeah, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. It's quite something, but it's kind of based around, I suppose, around voice and engagement and empowerment. So it's those are the kind of areas that we've been working towards with the impact campaign, and that's where we're at the moment.
Thanks, Ellie. Fantastic to hear about all those developments. Yeah, just thinking about, you mentioned the different entities that might be thought of as having some responsibility in this case. So the Chilean state, the Chilean company, I think called Promel, that was responsible for treating the waste, the Swedish state, Boliden itself. William, a question for you. You chose to focus almost entirely on Boliden in this film. Could you explain a little bit more about that decision? Was it because you considered Boliden to have the greatest responsibility? To what degree do those other actors have responsibility in this case, in your view?
Yes, of course. So first, I mean, it was important for us to also show the other actors. So we have a couple of scenes. For example, when Rodrigo very early in the film says that there are 4 main responsible: the Swedish government, the Chilean government, the Swedish company Boliden, and the Chilean company Promel. But for us, I think the interesting thing is also a little bit, you know, what Ellie was talking about, is toxic colonialism, and where this big, very successful European country sends its toxic waste to a dictator, you know, a country run by a brutal dictator. And Chile at the time was quite poor. I mean, it's not like now. It was 85. It was very, very different. So I think it was important for us to also mention the others, but we early on, our focus was Boliden for those reasons, and so also because that's our home. I mean, that's where we from. So that's sort of the story we wanted to really understand, and also when we came to Arica the first times. I can also mention the first film, in Toxic Playground, we have quite a lot of Promel, where you have Lars and Rolf going around, and they are investigating Promel quite a lot. So we have more of Promel in that film. But it was also quite obvious coming there that the people, I mean, at first they were more angry against the Chilean government and Promel, and because they are closer. They are people that they can actually go to and try to get to do something. And there had been court cases against the government in Chile and against Promel, but we were always told during this period that it would be impossible to do anything against the Swedish company because it was too long ago and too far away, and all of that. So yeah, that's the reason why we focused mostly on Boliden and their responsibility.
Great, thank you. Ellie, you mentioned just a minute ago, and William picking up on that point, that this would just not be acceptable in Europe or in many other places of the world. Rogelio, I wonder if I could bring you in here a bit with your knowledge of the Chilean context to talk us through a little bit about how it was that it was possible, you know, to dump this waste in Chile, and perhaps give us a sort of a historical perspective on some of the themes that are brought up by the film.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. I think as William has already mentioned, it's very significant that the waste was dumped during the Pinochet dictatorship, which is a very paradoxically a very timely issue at the moment, as Chile is writing its constitution from scratch. Because until now, despite 3 decades of democracy, Chile had the constitution that Pinochet had imposed in 1980. And the transition from dictatorship to democracy was notoriously too smooth for many people. Politically, Chile remained very neoliberal, as it had done during the dictatorship. And environmentally speaking, obviously environmental regulation was very lacking during the dictatorship, and there was a push to correct this in the early years of transition to democracy. For example, the system of environmental impact assessment, EIA, also Evaluación de Impacto Ambiental, it's the same acronym in Chile, was put into place during the early years of the democracy. But as the then president of Chile said, to reassure corporations, don't worry, the EIA is not there to turn down project proposals. it's there to approve them. So throughout this time, there has still been a lot of very justified resentment that corporations and extractive interests in the country are able to get away with seeking their own profits, often at the expense of not just the say economic interests of local communities, but their very health. Something that is perhaps most or best exemplified by so-called sacrifice zones, in which high levels of industrial and often toxic activity are allowed. So to bring this back to Joanna's point about taking a historical perspective, I think the film and the case of Arica and Boliden raise some very interesting questions about how come this was allowed during the dictatorship, but also what has not really changed with democracy, and to what extent will writing a new constitution and changing the institutions of Chile correct this. And I'll end by saying that perhaps one should be cautious with the hopes that things can change via constitutional change, because the Pinochet era constitution of Chile safeguards, in theory, the right of every Chilean person to a healthy environment. And despite that right being enshrined in the constitution, we can see that right has been violated multiple times in Chile. So perhaps the problem going forward and the solutions going forward are not just to do with laws and legislation, but with law enforcement and the ability of local communities to hold the state and corporations accountable to those laws.
Thanks, Rogelio. I think that's a really important point there. Paul, I know that you've been looking into the new constitution that's being drafted at the moment in Chile, and particularly the kinds of environmental protections that might be encoded into that. Can you comment at all on what you're seeing at the moment, any possible changes to the state's approach to environmental issues like this one in the future?
I can make a few comments. Yes, of course. I think, as Rogelio said, it's important to not get carried away. We are still at a very early stage of the drafting of a new constitution, although it is very exciting that, as Rogelio said, it is kind of being written again from scratch. There were elections for the Constitutional Convention earlier this year, and there was a great deal of excitement generated by the fact that a very large proportion of those elected were independent. They were not affiliated with any of the established political parties associated with that rather smooth transition to democracy from the dictatorship that Rogelio mentioned. And indeed, beyond that, a large proportion, I can't remember the exact, it might be up to about a third of those elected will call themselves environmental defenders in their own territories. So I think it might be a third of the independents, in fact. And the fact that there is, for the first time, guaranteed representation of many different indigenous communities in the Constitutional Convention, again, we might think that opens up avenues towards other ways of understanding our relationship to nature, the rights that we have in relation to nature, and the rights that nature might have. And the reason I mentioned this idea that nature itself, or the environment might have rights, is that I noticed just recently that the Environmental Commission of the Constitutional Convention, which has just started taking evidence this month from a range of different people, took evidence at the start of November from a scholar called Eduardo Gudinas, who has done a lot of writing in the field of political ecology and has really explored the concept of buen vivir, or the good life, that informs an understanding of nature in other constitutional and legal frameworks in Latin America, in Bolivia, or in Ecuador, for example. And this idea that that the natural world, so whether that's rivers or forests, might be endowed with certain constitutional rights that then might form the basis for legal action. And in his evidence to the commission, Gudinas was really encouraging them to keep an open mind about the kinds of value that that we might attach to nature, because as Rogelio was suggesting, under the current socioeconomic and socio-political framework in Chile, which there's a great deal of continuity between the time when Boliden were dumping their waste and now, the economic value of the natural world as something that can be extracted quite literally by mining corporations and others has been the predominant one. And Gudinas, in his evidence, was encouraging the Commission to think about other kinds of social values that might be attached to nature, for human well-being, values, spiritual values that are attached by indigenous communities and others, and an idea of a kind of autonomous ecological value as well. So I think it's fascinating and encouraging to see that those proposals are being listened to. We can't say much more than that at this stage, but as Rogelio was saying, you know, the fact that the current constitutional guarantee to a healthy an environment free of pollution has been so ineffective, as we've seen in this case, and in the persistence of these sacrifice zones along the coast and elsewhere, means that even the possibility of change is quite exciting.
Thanks, Paul. Coming now to think about the trial itself, which is the central focus of the film. Huge spoiler alerts here. But I think that many viewers will have felt as stunned as I did at the point where it's revealed that the appeal cannot be heard because the court has decided to change the legal system under which the case is being prosecuted from Chilean law to Swedish law. And this means that the time period in which a case can be brought has already expired. Rogelio, I know you wanted to ask Ellie some more about these processes to see if there's any light that she can shed on them.
Yeah, thank you. Ellie, I was very intrigued by when it is announced that the court has ruled in favor of Boliden. There's a sense on the Arica side that was a predetermined decision, and that the information and the evidence and the arguments were then retrofitted to this decision that would not change, which would be that Boliden would win. I was wondering whether you may have any insights on what may have motivated these suspicions in the first instance, but also were the suspicions to be correct, what might have motivated the Swedish court to rule in favor of Boliden, regardless of the available evidence, and to hold on to different things, such as at first Chilean law, and then when that didn't work, then revert or change to Swedish law to be able to maintain and reassert this ruling. Okay,
so yeah, so in the district court, which is the first hearing that we see, the court ruled that it did rule that Boliden were, quote, extraordinarily negligent in continuing to have a commercial relationship with Promel when they realized that the waste wasn't being processed, but went on to find that the claimants hadn't been able to prove that the arsenic in their body came from the arsenic that was dumped. I mean, it kind of, in a way, it kind of beggars belief. It's hard to imagine where else it would have come from. I think Boliden tried to claim it was from an excess of seafood, which is incredibly expensive and doesn't seem to be something that people really can afford or enjoy very much. But so in the first case, they found in Boliden's favour, but they did believe that Boliden were negligent to have continued their relationship with Promel once they realised that the waste wasn't being processed. So they basically lost on causation. And in the process of doing that, they were applying Chilean law, which is really, really quite interesting and exciting. The Arica victims took the case to appeal, and the Court of Appeal in Sweden, or at least in the district of Sweden where it was considered, didn't hear the case at all. They didn't consider the case on its merits because they said that the center of gravity, essentially, of the case was in Sweden. That they felt that the prime act which led to the harm suffered was Boliden's decision to export the waste, and because that happened in Sweden, Swedish law should be applied. It seems a little odd, it seems a little bizarre, but it meant that that decision, that was essentially 1984, and even I think there was some breadth where they could interpret it could be up to 1989, when I think might have been the final shipment. But even then, with a 10-year time limitation, it meant that people weren't able to bring any action at all after 1999 at the very, very latest, which essentially precluded the claimants from bringing the claim before the Swedish courts. They just said they were out of time. It's an odd decision. It's a really, really strange decision. It's out of kilter with the European Court of Human Rights. The difficulty is that materials like arsenic, when people become sick, years and years and years later after their exposure, it could be 25, 30 years after their exposure to it. And I think there's someone in the case says, you can bury a barrel of toxic waste for 10 years and then it's not your problem. And that's essentially what they've done. They've buried it, they've waited for 10 years and they're no longer liable for its consequences. So I think it's a hugely problematic decision. I think it's wrong in law, because Sweden, of course, is bound by the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights found in 2014 that in a similar case relating to asbestos, there was effectively a denial of access to justice for those victims where symptoms develop over a very, very, very long period of time. And that's certainly something that's been raised with the Swedish government by the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics. That said, the Swedish Supreme Court has refused to hear an appeal from the Court of Appeal. So that's done in Sweden. It can't go any further in Sweden. But there is an error in law, almost certainly. What happens next, I don't know. I know at one point, Jonas Eberson, who was one of the lawyers involved in the case, was talking about looking at options of taking it to Europe. In terms of what motivated them, I've no idea what motivated that kind of decision. It does seem bizarre. It seems like a very, very odd decision to take when there was clear European Court of Human Rights law to the contrary. I don't know if it was for fear of setting a precedent, perhaps, in which case I don't know how many huge piles of toxic waste Sweden has sitting overseas that it's worried about coming back. I know the Swedish government has certainly intimated or said very, very clearly that if Boliden did put their hands up and decide to take the waste back, they absolutely wouldn't stand in their way. So I think the government would quite like Boliden to do the right thing and take it back. But I don't think they're in a position to make them take it back either. So it's certainly a bizarre decision. I think it's wrong in law. But in terms of what the motivations were, I wish I could tell you, but
Thanks, Ellie, for those perspectives. Give us much broader understanding, I think, of what was going on at that point. Moving on to think now about the role of Arica and perhaps documentary films more generally in developing cases of this kind and instigating kind of social change. At one point in Arica, the voiceover reflects that the lawyers are going to be taking the case much further than the filmmakers could do. But of course, the film does play a huge role in the case. And I wondered, William, if you could give us your thoughts on the role that the two films really have about Arica have played in the trial, but also the broader campaign for compensation.
Yes. No, I mean, I would like to start from when we were in Arica filming Toxic Playground, and we were talking to Rodrigo to try to get some cases for the film and to meet more people and interview them, and he said, yeah, absolutely. He made some calls, and we were going to meet some people like in a backyard. And when we showed up, there were just so many, mostly women and their children, really, really sad, crying, and coming up to us and saying that, you know, my kid has this sickness and that sickness. They have brought medicine and said, you know, we have this, it's this medicine and that medicine, and we don't know what to do. Please help us. Please help us provide with health support. Please. And the only thing we could do then was to say that we are very sorry, but we will not be able to provide you any of that help. We have the power to hopefully make your voice stronger, and we can hopefully make you heard and get your story out. That's what we can do, and then hopefully others will follow that have this kind of skills. And I mean, that has even if the trial now didn't go the way we hoped, that has happened. I mean, the lawyers saw it, and I mean also with the impact campaign, and I mean the job that Ellie have done, using their skills, different people using their skill set to follow this story and have this impact made. And of course, I mean, the film was also part of it was used as evidence in the court, and but I think the main purpose of the film is sort of the spark to engage people and to make them know about this case, and also get emotionally involved in the case. And
Yeah, you mentioned just then that some of the film's footage, this is from Toxic Playground, wasn't it, was going to be used in evidence in the appeal. Is that right?
So it was actually used also in the first court as well. They showed the first day of court. They showed both times. They showed Toxic Playground in its whole. And also all our rushes with Rolf, all interviews that we have done with Rolf was seized by the court as evidence. So I think it was quite an important piece during the trial as an evidence as well.
Great. I think the film more broadly raises very interesting questions about its own status as a form of evidence, questions of truth as well. Paul, I know this is something that struck you particularly when you were viewing the film.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. It really did, because as you just mentioned, William, we see that the footage from Toxic Playground is used as evidence in the court. So you have this idea that, you know, I guess when we watch a documentary, we kind of on some level we think we're seeing the real world, right, in some way, in a kind of instinctive way. But then there's also that moment, kind of extraordinary moment towards the end, when they're discussing the photos that were taken by Rolf Svedberg on his trip there in the 80s. And there's one that the claimants for the lawyers for the Arica victims say, look, this shows a child playing at the Bromel factory. Therefore, you must have known that the children were going to play on this toxic waste, and the other side are able to argue, well, actually, does it really? You know, is the photograph is it that clear cut? Is it that trustworthy as evidence of what was really happening? So you have the two sides of it. The idea that film is a sort of reliable evidence of the real world, and then all the interpretation and the questioning. And again, you know, there's a moment towards the end when Rodrigo, I think the activist and anthropologist in Arica, says, well, look, they haven't come and seen our reality. So I'm just wondering how you kind of negotiate those questions when you're making the film, because it's a personal story, and yet there's also this question of legal evidence and the question of, small question of the relationship of film to reality. But I just wonder how those are sort of present for you when you're making the film.
Yes, very good question. And no, I mean, I think it was. I mean, I don't know where to start, but for us, it was also kind of evident that there were two different kind of realities also going on at the same time. It was kind of one logic and sort of reality in the courtroom that was based on mostly these documents that, for example, this consultant firm Exponent had produced. And then you had pictures, films, testimonies from the area, and which was, and they were not given as high value, or at least I didn't. I mean, I'm not an expert of that, but from what I could understand from sitting through all of this and also going through everything, and also with the verdict in mind, it seemed like the written reports and documents were given higher value. And I think for the film, when that's also when you get these two, I mean, when you go to court and you have some lawyers having a quite logic argument about you putting maybe, but it might be like that, maybe it might be like that. And then when you cut to the reality of people who have lived just a couple of meters in front of this toxic mountain, and their kids might have died or are extremely sick, it becomes sort of really, really obvious that no, so it is something we have struggled a lot, talked about a lot, and had as because also we wanted the audience to understand the court case. We wanted Boliden to get the best arguments out there. So we had to go into this logic with the numbers and the documents, and to also try to show that fight in the courtroom as well. Whatever we thought about the relevance of those states or those, because in the end, that means winning and losing, and that will mean very big consequences for the people affected. Yeah.
I mean, I think if I just can come back briefly, I think, yeah, you set out the kind of the conundrum there very, very well, because there's the logic of the courtroom, and then in the interviews with the victims and elsewhere, there's the kind of emotional truth that comes through that doesn't have legal, wouldn't have legal standing, but is incredibly powerful. I'm just thinking of a moment when Rodrigo, the anthropologist from Arica, goes to Sweden, and the camera just lingers on him playing with the snow, right? And there's no kind of immediate relevance to that moment. But to me, at least, I think, gosh, well, that's what people do, right? And I just thought about the children playing on the toxic waste dump, and you think, well, that's it's a human reaction, a kind of emotional truth, which is really powerful. But obviously, you couldn't present it as evidence in a courtroom.
Oh, absolutely, good point.
Just thinking about the evidence that was presented in the courtroom, one of the very interesting elements of the film for me, thinking about its strategies as a documentary, was that, of course, you weren't given access to video recordings of the witnesses speaking for Boliden during the trial. They could decide whether to give you access to that material, and I think most of them said no. You did have access to the audio, which is in the public domain, but not the images. Can you talk us through when you first realized that this was going to be the case, how you then made the decision about how to represent those scenes in the film? Were there other choices that you considered about how to include those scenes in the story of the trial?
Yes, that has been a big problem. Actually, at first, we were struggling to get any moving images from the courtroom, because you're not allowed to film in the court, and I don't know if any other filmmakers have actually been able to get the video testimonies either, also with the consent. So we had to try that out and send in different, asking the court in different ways to. So we started out with Lars, because he gave a testimony, and wrote in different ways, you know, where Lars had signed that he wanted the material to be sent to us, and then when that worked, we knew that we had something, we could get the material out as long as we got the people signing it. And the Arica side, all of them signed it. It was no problem. But actually, none of the victims on Boliden side signed it. So we quite early started trying with this animations. And first we had a lot of animations, but then it became a little bit too much, and so then we didn't have any animation. And then we had, so it was actually going back and forward in the editing, trying to figure out. It was really difficult to figure it out beforehand and then just go with it, which would have been much more efficient. But we had to struggle a little bit. And the first cuts that we had, I mean, luckily not many had to see them, and some other people, but they're like more than 4 hours long, and most of the court scenes are a document, or, you know, just to get the story in place. But no, it has been it was a struggle to find a way to visualize the court case.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you selected the interviews with people in Arica who feature in the film? Were there a lot of people that you interviewed and you just selected a few of them? How did you decide sort of which stories to focus on?
We interviewed quite a lot of people, and I mean, we quite early understood that we wanted to have Jocelyn play a quite important role, also because of our emotional bonds to her, and so even if her family, well, haven't been, I mean, you never know what will happen, but so far she have had a lot of problems, but her kids didn't so far, luckily. So hopefully that will be like that. But she had to live with this anxiety of not knowing, which we thought was very strong. So that was obvious for us to follow her. And then also Rodrigo, to have him, because he's doing such an amazing work, and without him it wouldn't have been a court case. Without, I mean, he's so key, and has also been in the impact campaign afterwards. And so having somebody in the community to be also a main character was also important. And after that, it was, you know, also a little bit like the images in the courtroom. We had a lot of interviews, and we had to decide a little bit, because even if you have a lot of strong stories and they are different, you sometimes, I mean, it's just so much that you can take in, and you need to then go forward. So we had to do some difficult choices when we choose, but it was the choice of who we then used was very much decided in the editing room.
Thanks. Paul, I know you had one or two more questions about different filming techniques that William and Lars used.
Yeah, it kind of follows on from that, the question about interviews, actually, because a lot of the film consists of interviews or of Lars kind of chasing after people with a microphone trying to get an interview when they don't want to give one. So there's a kind of close-up, real kind of liveness to it, which is very engaging. And then because there's a lot of that, the moments where we have these aerial shots of Arica and of Skellefteå, I apologize for my pronunciation, Skellefteå in the north of Sweden, where Boliden is based, really stand out, because we suddenly take a step back. We're getting an aerial perspective, and I wondered, yeah, what role those shots have for you, and as you were putting the film together, was it about getting a different perspective? There are also some shots of nature. I mean, for me, I felt myself feeling like they were establishing certain kinds of parallels, perhaps trying to bridge that divide between they're obviously two places that are very far apart, but the idea that Arica can just be sort of invisible for Boliden. So was the idea to kind of think about parallels, or yeah, what was your thinking with those aerial shots, the longer shots that we have?
Absolutely. I mean, they have different purposes. One is also just, you know, to get the pause and to let things sink in, but we also wanted to, I mean, it's very nice to work with this contrast with the snow and the sand, and in some ways the landscapes are very similar, and in others they are not. And also have birds in Arica and some bird in Sweden. It's sort of, like you say, it binds them together, but it also shows the differences in the same way. And we have some of the sky, and you have the sky in Sweden and the sky in Arica, and it's like the same sky, and same goes with the ocean. And so yeah, I think I think you put it in a very nice way, the parallel and yeah. And I mean, that is also, I mean, we've had that in mind, what we wanted to do and why, and that we have been thinking of these contrasts, and that it's the same place. It didn't end up, but I had some really nice shots of a surfer in Arica, and I wanted to cut it to a guy skiing in Skellefteå. It was also quite funny because I had this crash, and it was a lot of snow going up. So. But it was a little bit too far away, so it didn't work. So yeah, and so actually that was also, we had this idea, we collected this material, and in the end that was also something that we found out in the editing room, how to build that.
Thanks, that's really interesting. Just before we draw things to a close, a final question, both for William and Ellie, if I can. William, can you tell us a bit more about how you see your involvement in the Arica campaign going forwards, or what the next steps for you are in film directing? And Ellie, perhaps can you tell us something about where you see yourself moving in these areas in the next while, or any further comments that either of you want to make about the film, the process, etc.?
When it comes to planning a new film on this topic, me and Lars, we haven't planned anything, but we are in contact with the people in Arica more or less every week, talking to Rodrigo quite a lot. And we didn't plan to do Arica either before the lawyers phoned us up. So you never know. When it comes to this and what have happened in Arica in this case, I mean, I know that both me and Lars will be involved in this. It is part of our lives now, so it will be something we will follow up in one way or another. So when it comes to other work, we at my company Leica Film, we do a lot of investigative stories and social documentaries, and also some fiction films. So we'll continue on more or less the same kind of stories, at least. And when it comes to what's also happening in Sweden now, which I think is a bit interesting, Elliot said it with this discussion of sending this waste back. So there was this debate in the Swedish parliament where the environmental minister at first, he was quite defensive and didn't really answer to anything. But then he said, okay, but if there is a question coming from Chile, we will consider it. And that became news in Chile. And there was discussions, and it was a majority in the Senate that wanted this. So it is like real discussions going on. We know that there have been contacts. But of course, it's nothing. We don't have any insight in it, but it's something that we are very curious about what will happen.
Thank you, Ellie.
I think one of the things that's really struck me with this film is the fact that it's run alongside an ongoing court case, and as a lawyer, I've found that really, really interesting. I think there's some real work to be done in how documentary film may or may not have the potential to plug gaps in justice. And I think because as lawyers, certainly we tend to approach justice in something that you achieve in a courtroom. And in this situation, we approached the impact campaign through a justice lens, but mindful that there was an ongoing legal case. And we weren't bringing proceedings. We had to do anything but bring proceedings before a court. And we also had to make very, very sure that we didn't do anything that affected the legal case, but we were still thinking about justice. And I think there's some real potential about how we think about justice much more broadly, just in terms of what victims of sort of mass victimization type things, not just sort of huge waste scandals, but also mass atrocity crimes, what they need in terms of a remedy as a result. And if it's, voice or empowerment, then, a court might not be the best place or the only place for them to achieve that. So I think there's a huge amount of potential and potentially a lot of work to be done in looking at how film might be used for other justice type purposes and what that means for victims within their justice journey, if that makes sense. I think where there's always the potential for a legal action as well, I think what this film has really highlighted for me is that we need to be very, very careful. And what's been so great about this project is that William and Lars and Andreas at Leica Film are superb investigative journalists, and what they write is accurate, and it's tested and it's fact-checked and it's watertight, because we were also mindful that it, it needed to be screened, but also that we had to be safe from litigation by Boliden or anyone else. So, but I think while that's true of this film, I'm not sure that's necessarily true of every film that centers around human rights issues where there's an injustice, and I think that's a real issue. So, for example, as in other areas of work that I do around for example, around war crime investigation, if we have someone who has given an interview to the press or the media, we tend not to use them as a witness because there's the potential for contradiction. And we see it in the film, Rolf contradicts himself, what he says in court, and there's something of, so from Boliden's perspective, Rolf was a bit of a disaster witness because he'd exposed himself on film by saying something different. So, I think they can rub along, and I think one can support the other when they're done well. I think there's different evidential standards when you're collecting information for a documentary compared with collecting information for a courtroom, and that's not to disregard one or the other, but I think it's something to be very, very mindful of when we're using one in the other, or one may lead to the other, or what have you. So, but I think there's some real work to be done around film's potential to fill justice gaps, and also what that means for the people who are involved in it. If it's then experienced by those individuals as a realization of an essence of justice through voice engagement, those kind of things. So that's kind of broadly where I suppose I'd love to explore next, but we'll see.
Thank you, Ellie. That's a fascinating kind of broader reflection to end on, really, that very complex relationship between documentary filmmaking, legal cases, but then also justice. Very interesting. Thank you to Paul and Rogelio for joining us on the panel, but particularly huge congratulations to William, to Ellie for the film, but also the broader campaign, all the activity organised around that. And all the very best with the next steps. I'm sure that we're all wishing you and also the Arica claimants the very best for the future. Thanks and goodbye to everybody.